Good morning, students. Hope you're well. This lecture will be for Wednesday, April the 8th. As we were last talking, we discussed the build-up toward World War II. And as your textbook is set up, sadly, we've got a chapter that intervenes there. But it is important that we look at things that were taking place in Asia and East Asia as we look at the period between World War I and World War II, because quite a few things were happening over there as well. Now, one thing that is very much taking place during the 1930s is, in spite of the Depression, American culture has really dominated the world. And many individuals are looking at America, some in a positive way, some in less than a positive way. But they are looking at the U.S., and there are things they want to emulate. There are things that obviously they do not. And one of the things that is going to happen in Asia and East Asia especially is, following World War I, nationalism is going to develop into a very powerful force. And two nations that have pretty much been carved up and divided on for years are going to become nationalistic centers. And those are going to be India and China. Now, remember, nationalism is an idea that carries with it a concept of commonality, common language, common traditions, common this, common that. Well, India and China, in spite of what has gone on as a result of imperialism, both have strong elements of that going on. Well, Japan has already gone through its period of nationalism, and so as Japan, in the period between the wars, becomes more and more dissatisfied with its status in the East and in the world itself, it turns to militarism. As I say, it's already nationalized, and so it turns to militarism as its binding power to bring them together. Well, one thing the British are going to do in India that helps the British, but it helps Indian nationalism as well. They're going to build a huge railroad system to move raw goods here, there, and yonder, and so on. And in doing so, people from southern India or central India meet people from the northern part. In other words, they begin to mix together in ways they have never done before. And in a remote way, similar to what took place in the United States, they begin to see that they have quite a few things in common. And so, an Indian identity begins to develop. And this would be a very natural outcome of a railroad system like that. Now, this, shall we say, for the British, is kind of an unintended consequence, and yet one that is found. So in 1885, we're backing up a little bit, an Indian National Congress is formed, and it wants to work with the British to bring self-ruled India. Okay, let's realize the United States won its independence. Canada has now developed self-rule in the latter part of the 19th century. And so this is a goal they begin to pursue. But things really drag on, and after World War I, Britain has no real desire whatsoever to give up India as a colony. And so this Congress begins to push its goals in opposition to the British government. And this introduces us probably to one of the most famous modern Indians that we know of. His name is Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi grew up in a very prosperous Hindu home, and in 1888 he will actually go to London to study law. So he knew the British legal system for sure. Then he's going to spend a period of about 22 years in South Africa, again, a British colony. And he's going to embrace some qualities that are going to go with him for the rest of his life. Many of them will be qualities that, quite honestly, grow out of his Hindu background. One is tolerance. Another is nonviolence, and then he will develop an idea of passive resistance. And these are going to be the three things that Gandhi is going to lead the Indian people in trying to bring about an independent Indian state. Now, one thing that I think is important as we look at these ideas, Dr. Martin Luther King will borrow these ideas from Gandhi in his phase of the American Civil Rights Movement, because he did see the effect it will bring in India. And, of course, in his dream and hope, he dreamed of a positive effect coming about in the United States as well. Gandhi will finally return to India in 1915, so during World War I. And his unique mixture of spiritual intensity and political activism will very much appeal to a very broad section of the Indian population. And let's do realize, yes, there are Indian soldiers engaged in World War I. But one of the things Gandhi is going to attack is something that is very Indian and very Hindu. But he feels it is part of the major problem that is causing difficulties for India to move into the modern world, and that is the injustices of the caste system. He's going to very much oppose that. And so, as a part of his process, and it's going to take years to bring it about, Gandhi is going to encourage, as the North American colonies had done, to boycott British goods, to wear homespun clothing, and to become as self-sufficient and independent as they possibly could. And ultimately, after years of opposition and sometimes quite violent opposition, and also years of fighting, if you will, Indian independence, the Government of India Act will give India instructions on self-governing state. So beginning in 1937, and then interrupted by World War II, India will be moving toward independence. And finally, in 1947, they will be an independent entity from Britain. Interestingly, as we have noted, a lot of Muslims had lived in India from time to time. There had been a Muslim dominance of northern India for years and years. And the Muslims are very unhappy about a new Hindu nation because Muslims and Hindus didn't normally play very nicely together. And so, as it will occur, India will actually split. You will have the northwestern portion be renamed Pakistan, and it will be a primarily Muslim state. Then the remainder of India will be a primarily Hindu state. And there are many, many pictures that the main roads between these two segments will be loaded with people. Indians leaving Pakistan to go to India because they are Hindus, Muslims leaving India and going to Pakistan because they are Muslims. So actually, in the independence of India, we get two new independent states in the world. And basically, they have been at odds against each other since their independence. All right, first half of the 20th century, China was almost in constant revolutionary upheaval. Finally, in 1911, the emperor will be forced to advocate. And by the way, the emperor at that time was a mere child. And so the military is going to step in. But the revolution as a whole that took place will actually fail. So an individual named Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a leading opponent of the old regime, will become the first provisional president of what would become the new Chinese Republic in 1912. So finally we move away from the various Chinese dynasties that we have seen, and we have the formation of a republic. Of course, as can happen, and realize China's background was so very different from the North American colonies, that soon everything is in political anarchy. There's economic disintegration going on. Warlords are rising to power. You have these warlords generally being generals who had been removed from power for one reason or another. And so they established themselves as provincial rulers, and they contributed to the further disintegration of Chinese society. During this time, a whole new cultural movement arises, and this will come out of the universities. They will want to westernize China, but China being primarily rural, China being primarily agrarian, this intellectual movement had very little influence upon the peasants of China, and so once again, it did not prosper very well. Now, although foreigners did not control this provincial state, they had a tremendous amount of influence as a result of the privileges that they had imposed into Chinese law. And so, again, Chinese nationalism begins to flourish, and we have what is called a May 4th movement. This, once again, comes out of the universities, and it is going to begin to embrace all classes of Chinese people as they protest against foreign and most especially at that time, Japanese interference in their affairs. And so this movement is going to grow and have a powerful effect upon the Chinese people. Now, many are going to be interested in Marxist thought, and they are going to look at the Soviet Union rather than the West. And this is ultimately going to lead China into a civil war. Now, the nationalist leader that is going to arise is Sun Yat-sen, and he will call, number one, for the elimination of all foreign privileges, a national reunification, new economic development, and development of a Republican government, so that would be anti-Soviet Union, leaning toward universal suffrage. So this would be giving women the vote. Now, that's shocking because women in China have always had such an inferior position. But after his death in 1925, leadership falls to an individual westernized as Chiang Kai-shek. And he will set up a government that tries to unify and build a sovereign Chinese state. And because China is struggling so much to rebuild itself and come back together and, of course, build a cohesive government, they're actually going to dodge something that affected the West tremendously. And that was the Great Depression. Of course, they're trying to build a new society, and the Great Depression just did not affect them like it did the other parts of the world because they were not as strongly industrialized as other parts of the world. So the communists are kind of put out of business for a while in 1934, and they will arise again following World War II. And let's realize that World War II is going to be devastating upon the Chinese people. It is going to be a horrific time for them. Okay. In 1922, Japan will join the League of Nations, even though we couldn't sell the United States on that. And it will become one of the big five powers. And during the international agreements that are going on with Britain and France and Italy and even the United States and so on, leading the way in these things, Japan will agree to limit its naval development. And it will ultimately guarantee China's territorial integrity, even withdrawing some of its troops. Now, Japanese business profited greatly from selling munitions to the Allies throughout World War I. And they gained a bigger foothold in Asia as the war led Europe's trading nations to neglect their Asian markets. So the war distracted Western Europe. Japan just politely moves in to that vacuum that takes place. But there, during the 30s, is an increasingly frustrated and disenchanted public that blames the government for China's economic problems. And of course, Japan was affected by the Great Depression. And so more militant elements began to intervene and influence and fill the cabinet of Japan. And these more militant people are dominated by advocates of expansion and extreme patriotic organizations tend to rise. Now, of course, Japanese religion is generally Shinto, which does involve a worship of the state. But during the 30s, this goes on steroids. I mean, they literally worship the state. The state is it. The state is what is important. And more, these elements begin to move and influence the Emperor of Japan. And they move towards suspicion of the West. So by 1931, and, of course, as we will note, a war will bring the United States out of the Great Depression. And as sad as that may sound, sometimes that's how nations get out of depressions, is by going to war. So in 1931, to get more natural resources, Japan's military forces expand into Manchuria, which technically had been Chinese territory. Within a year, so a quick moving campaign, within a year, they controlled all of Manchuria. And then they begin to embark on a series of conquests in East Asia, and they are trying to find secure means of obtaining natural resources to be able to keep their military industrial machines working. And of course, there will be some resistance, minor, but some, from the United States. And as the United States begins these resistant movements, the militaristic elements in Japan become more animated and more influential and move Japan and the United States further and further apart. And so the 1930s is not a great decade for U.S.-Japanese relationships. All right. How about Africa? Well, remember, in the age of imperialism, the late 19th century, the European powers had just totally carved Africa up. And during the peace negotiations in Paris, Africa, many of the states pleading for some kind of social and political reform, were totally ignored. Nothing they wanted put on the table, so to speak, was put on the table. Rather, the European powers that were left, and realize Germany had been kicked out, the European powers that were left actually focused more on economic exploitation than they had even before the war. Now, what is interesting is Africans actually fought in World War I. They generally fought on the side of whatever European power dominated their particular territory. But it is estimated that more than 1 million African soldiers actually participated directly in some kind of campaigns during World War I. But after the war, opportunities for rebellion and protest do increase because let's realize Europe had been weakened, and they had been weakened severely by World War I. And so the European presence tended to thin out some in Africa. And again, as this happens, nationalistic aspirations and other things begin to flow into some of these nations, and they more and more want their independence. Well, let's look. They had seen what had occurred in the world. The U.S. getting independence, Haiti getting independence, Latin America getting independence. These various places getting independence, including China, which had been on the latter end of the imperialistic push of the 19th century. And so seeing all of these things, the colonial powers still tried to push for major institutions of a bureaucracy, a judiciary, police, and military forces to keep the Africans in subjection. And then your textbook uses that word, and I think that's a very good word to use, subjection there. But some of these African nations begin to develop an export-oriented economy that is actually going to wind up becoming a benefit to them as they are able to move more and more toward independence. And as it looks like a spark is going to happen, yes, the Great Depression that affected Europe affected Africa. And so all of a sudden these economies that had begun to take an upturn suddenly began to slide. And of course, Africa is basically right back in the same boat they were in before. Their wealth still going out, going to the European powers, and so on. Farming and mining are going to become huge adventures in Africa. Africans are basically forced to become cash crop farmers or to seek wage laborers on plantations or become very exploited workers in mines. And obviously the big elements that they are looking for are copper, gold, diamonds, and this is mainly in Central and Southern Africa. Railroads and roads will often depend on forced labor, and so where India is going to be united together, not so much so for Africa. And as they come to the end of World War I, they are really disappointed that they don't receive some kind of reward, some kind of benefit, whatever. Now, President Wilson actually talked about allowing Africans to be self-determining of their own future. And you can imagine this is one of the points, especially the British and the French, would have been ardently opposed to. But this was one of Wilson's points. Let's let Africa become determining of its own future. And yet, no, the nationalists want to hold on. So, there will be, though, and this will ultimately help Africa as it does begin to move toward its independence, a new social class an elite, if you want to call them that. And this will be Africans who have had European-style education. They have been employed somehow with a European country or state, and they have been converted to Christianity. So all of these things are going to form a foundation, if you will, a background that will help these African states work toward their independence. And as they have these European ideas, they begin to develop an African identity. Now, Africa will do as Latin America did. They will not develop into one big nation, but nationalism within certain regions will help ultimately carve out national identities for various African states. So, they do embrace the European concept of a nation as needing to forge a unity. And as they forge this national unity, they also realize we're going to have to resist these colonial powers. And so Africans are going to form identities based on ethnic, religion, language, and they believed that Africa was only going to grow by distinctly African spiritual and political institutions. So, yes, they are borrowing some ideas from the West. They want to use ideas from the West, but at the same time, they want to be uniquely African. They want to be themselves, their own people. And they realize they are different from the West. So we will have a strain of African nationalism known as Pan-Africanism, and this will be the closest idea that will arise to one African state. But most areas, since they weren't exactly national states yet, most areas look to that identity that existed there as being the identity that would develop a national state in that area. Now, I realize sometimes this idea is a little bit difficult to understand, but tribal influences in Africa, even though we are in the 20th century, are still alive and well. And Africans tend to know their background, they tend to know their history, and as these independent national states begin to develop in Africa, these backgrounds and histories and languages and traditions, all of these things are going to come to play and have a very important aspect as these various African states begin to form. Well, let's take a look at Latin America. Last time we left them, they weren't exactly in the best of shape. Latin America had pretty much become dependent on outside investments, and to a great extent, beginning with Teddy Roosevelt and moving forward from that time, outside interference, if necessary. The big brother to the north could interfere whenever they wanted to. And of course, what a lot of this interference is going to do is create jealousy on one hand, but it is also going to create a lot of anger Latin Americans are going to look very much on their North American neighbor with suspicion. And so Latin America is going to wind up being, even if it is not colonially invaded like Africa and China were, it is going to be very much colonially influenced. And so between 1924 and 1929, U.S. banks and businesses are going to more than double their financial interests in Latin America. And, of course, when the Great Depression comes then and the United States shuts down, it is going to show just how utterly dependent Latin America had become upon these North American and European investments. And it's going to hurt them tremendously. They are going to suffer during the Depression from huge plummeting prices. And one of the biggest mistakes the Latin American states are going to make is to, and the only way I can put this is this way, they're going to put their eggs all in one basket. They're primarily going to have one major export product. And that's not good business. That's not wise at all. But that's what's going to occur in Latin America. And a lot of these one exports are going to revolve around agricultural products. So if there is a collapse in the market, there's going to be a collapse within a country that is dependent upon one product to help keep and sustain its economy. So, a lot of problems going to go on. Central South America are going to have dictators arise. There are going to be difficulties within governments. They're not going to get along with each other. They're not going to get along with the United States. And there are going to be some tremendous problems that will arise. And it is going to come out of the Great Depression that the U.S. realizes it's really got to do a lot of work to improve its relations with Latin America. And in the event of another global war, that is going to become something that the United States is going to consider vital. And while the United States considers that vital, the problem is Latin America is not so sure, because they're not so sure that they want to trust their neighbor to the north. So, all of this brings us back to World War II. Now, as we have already noted, in 1931, Japan will invade Manchuria and ultimately take it over. Japan will then turn around and invade China. And they will conquer a huge chunk of China. And I will say this, the Japanese conquest of China is horrifically brutal indeed. And so while the war itself will actually begin in Asia, there have been a lot of things going on in Europe as well. And once again, we have two major alliances that are squaring off against each other. But this time, Austria is not the dominant power. It is definitely Germany, as we have seen its rise. And of course, Germany has a fairly staunch, it thinks, ally in Italy. Now, what is going to happen in Europe is going to be a combination of, shall we say, appeasement. Hitler's going to say, well, I only want to do this, and France and Britain don't want a war. So they're going to kind of let it ride. And then Hitler, okay, I got away with this, so I'll get away with this. And again, France and Britain will let it ride, and Hitler will get away with something else. So actually, the policy of appeasement is going to embolden Hitler. And Hitler will ultimately go on his plan. And his plan is to accomplish what Napoleon attempted to accomplish. Hitler wanted to rule Europe. So, we take Manchuria. 4 years later, we go into China. And in the city of Nanjing, it is quite interesting. It is said that in the course of 2 months, Japanese soldiers raped 7,000 women, murdered hundreds of thousands of unarmed soldiers and civilians, and burned more than 1/3 of the homes in the city. So as I say, it was a brutal invasion indeed. And kind of like what was going on in Europe, appeasement took place. Nobody wanted to stand up against the Japanese. Now, one thing that the Japanese will accomplish that they did not intend to is they will set fire to Chinese nationalism. And there will be a huge guerrilla warfare that will begin. The guerrillas will not defeat the Japanese, but they will gain the loyalty of many of the Chinese peasants, and this is going to play into future developments in China after the war. Now, there's lots of opposition. Everybody's saying, oh, you shouldn't do that, but no one stands up. And so Japan will actually ally itself with Germany and Italy. And so with the Chinese invasion, things kind of shift. And now they go toward Europe. Italy, as I say, was disappointed. Following World War I, they thought they should have done better than they did. And so Mussolini was able to take that dissatisfaction and fan it and create a military power. And so Italy comes along and will conquer Ethiopia in 1935. By the way, you will have Italian tanks fighting mounted Ethiopian cavalry. So you can imagine how well that resistance did not work at all. In 1936, they will annex Libya. And Libya was oil rich. And so this is going to be very, very important for the Italian/German military machine. So they begin to create for themselves something they've never really had, an overseas empire. In 1939, they will annex Albania. So a lot of things taking place. And basically Britain and France are sitting back, and the United States, and no one is doing anything. Oh, it's okay. It won't go too far. It won't be too bad. Okay. Then in Germany, Hitler took the Versailles Treaty and he beat it every way it could possibly be beat. He called it the November Crime and wanted to blame everyone for Germany's loss in World War I except Germany. You know, it had to be someone else. So, he's trying to fan his nation into taking action to correct the unfair provisions of that Versailles Treaty. So in 1933, Germany will withdraw from the League of Nations. That should have been a huge red flag. And yet, what it does is allow Hitler to kind of move behind the scenes and accomplish what he wishes to do. So moving somewhat like Italy had done, in 1938, Hitler will force a union with Austria. Basically, it is bloodless, but Austria is suddenly forced in to the arena with Germany. Britain and France do nothing. The Nazis attempt to gain control of the Sudetenland, part of what they had lost in World War I. And Britain and France accommodated Hitler. Well, it really was German for years and years. And so by the end of 1936, we can pretty much say that the Versailles Treaty had been scrapped. It was gone. Hitler had done away with that. At the Munich Conference in 1938, literally, Europeans form a policy of appeasement. In other words, stick your head in the sand. They wanted to keep peace in Europe, even if it meant making major concessions. And the U.S., all it wanted was to be neutral. Leave us out of this. So in 1939, German troops occupy Czechoslovakia. See the parallel with Italy. Then Hitler goes after Poland. And in going after Poland, Hitler comes up with a new form of warfare. And early in the war, this is so very, very effective. It is called blitzkrieg. Literally, it means lightning warfare. Now, what it involved was the use of tanks, highly mobile infantry, and air cover. So you've got movable artillery, you've got your infantry on the move, and you've got Air Force involved. They had an airplane called the Stuka, which was a dive bomber, and they used it very, very effectively. And so Poland is going to turn around and basically fall in a matter of weeks. And of course, this is going to scare Stalin because that's moving kind of close to him. And supposedly, Germany and Russia will have kind of an understanding, supposedly. And that'll kind of keep Russia off their back for a little while. So, Poland falls, and within a month, they're looking toward occupying Denmark, Norway, then Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. And literally, like dominoes, Western Europe begins to fall. France will literally fall in 6 weeks. The British will come and try to help the French. It doesn't do any good. And literally, the British and French troops are driven to the coast and are in danger of either being annihilated or captured by the Nazi juggernaut. And one of the most interesting stories in all of history comes to play here. The German populace is moving. They are about to hit the beaches at what is called Dunkirk. And the British citizens hear about it. Ordinary fishermen, ordinary boat owners, not big military ships, not big commercial ships, but just ordinary people get their ships going. They go over and they ferry as many British and French troops off that beach as they possibly can. It is an amazing, amazing story in World War II. And a lot of soldiers' lives will be saved. Now, they had to leave equipment and everything else in the hands of the Nazis. But every soldier saved was a soldier that would be ready for the future. And as those French and British soldiers are driven into the ocean, a few years later, they're going to come back out of the ocean. And they're going to re-invade France. And this time drive all the way to Berlin. So it was remarkable. So very, very quickly, Britain is the only nation standing against Germany. And Hitler has his eyes on Britain. And so Germany will launch what is called the Battle of Britain. And they realize they have to do several things before they invade. Number one, they're going to have total air dominance. And number two, they're going to have to pound the British people into submission. So the German Luftwaffe, which is their military air force, will rain bombs on populated metropolitan areas, including London. They will do everything they can to beat the British people into the ground. And by the way, the British people just stubbornly resist. They have a prime minister who probably didn't have the greatest speaking voice in the world, but he sure did know what to say when it needed to be said. And Winston Churchill was able to rally the British people. So Germany is going after total superiority in the air. There was just one major problem. The British had a fighter plane, which at the beginning of World War II was the best in the air. It was better than anything Germany had. It was better than anything the Japanese had. It was called the Spitfire. It was a very maneuverable plane with a Rolls-Royce engine. So you've got one of the finest manufactured engines in the world powering this plane. They were very quick, they were very maneuverable, and they inflicted horrific damage on the German Luftwaffe. After the campaign had begun to fail, The commander of the Luftwaffe will actually come to France and ask his commanding general, what does he need to be able to defeat the British Air Force? And his response is going to be a squadron of Spitfires. This is how good the plane was. And so the Royal Air Force will be able to stave off defeat. Hitler will never be able to put together his invasion force and go across to land German troops in Britain. So this is, I guess we could call it a defeat. We could call it definitely the stoppage of the German advance. And so Germany now is going to turn its eyes in another direction. And as we said, Hitler had somewhat held Stalin at bay, but Hitler failed to learn one of the lessons of history. Russia has an ally. You don't want to mess with Russia's ally. Now, Napoleon was foolish and invaded Russia in September. Hitler's going to be smarter. He's going to invade Russia in July. But what the Russians do is quite amazing. They just simply withdraw. They dismantle factories. They burn things. They give Germany a scorched earth policy. And of course, they're drawing Germany deeper and deeper and deeper into Soviet territory. Germany has huge supply lines that they're trying to keep. And of course, the Russians are filtering in behind and attacking these supply lines. And the Russians finally accomplish just exactly what they want to do. They drag it out to the point that the Germans are caught in Russia in winter. And believe me, students, living in a trench in the wintertime in Russia is not the most wonderful thing in the world. I have been to Russia in September, and it snowed. I have been to Russia in April, and there's huge mounds of snow, and snow still coming down. Snow is Russia's friend, and definitely snow was Germany's enemy. Germany will have to maintain a front of about 1,900 miles. They will near the gates of Moscow. They will get to Stalingrad in 1942, and in Stalingrad, there will be a bog dam. Literally, Germany will be forced into a bloody street-by-street fighting, and it will be horrific. It is estimated that more than 180,000 Soviet people died in a winter in Stalingrad. And yet, the commander of Stalingrad did something most interesting. He put all of his military supplies in one Orthodox church building, and he lit it up every night. Now, there were people who thought, this guy is crazy. You're presenting a target for the German artillery. But he had sense enough to know the German artillery wouldn't destroy that building because they could target all around it and try to destroy the city of Stalingrad. So he was able to save his military supplies. And so in that brutal, brutal winter of 1942, 1943, Germany has now been stopped again. So in the West, they're stopped at the coast of France. In the east, they're stopped outside of Moscow and outside of Stalingrad. And come spring, the Soviets are going to turn around and they are going to begin to launch an offensive, pushing the Germans back. And, believe it or not, in World War II, the Soviets and the Allies wind up on the same side. The enemy of my enemy becomes my friend, and that's what happened in this situation. And so they will become allies together. The U.S. will be funneling military supplies to the Soviet Union. But the purpose is going to be that hopefully, as the Soviets move westward, the rest of the Allies are going to be able to invade France and move eastward and trap the German armies in the middle. Now, unlike World War I, and this is very, very important for you to bear in mind, unlike World War I, Germany will have to fight a two-front war the entire duration of World War II. And so Hitler, thinking he was going to build a Reich that would last 1,000 years, is going to be very, very wrong as the world begins to respond back. And the war will ultimately be brought home to him. Now, I will say something here. Thankfully, Hitler wasn't the great military leader that Hitler thought himself to be. And that's going to be very, very important for the Allied cause, to say the least. Okay, students, this is a good place to stop, so we'll pause here. We'll come back and look at what goes on in Asia. I hope you will be safe and take care of yourself.